You all know our friend Juri Strumpflohner.
He's an enterprise Angular knowledge donor.
Here to teach you all about reactive forms
So you can build an app that outperforms.
Thanks for a nice introduction. All right, welcome everyone. So probably not everyone of you knows, but I was here at the very first edition of NGB, and I came here as an attendee. And the cool thing there was I tweeted about it 2 weeks before or something, and some arbitrary member from the community came up and said, "Hey man, I'm coming to the airport and pick you up and bring you to the venue." And I was like, I don't even know him. And now I know him, it's Martin. And that kind of welcoming atmosphere, that kind of feeling is actually what makes Angular for me, what the Angular community is for me. And it's the same with NGB. And so of course, the next year I had to come back, but this time as a speaker. And fun fact, it was my very first talk at the conference at that time. I had spoken at meetups, but never at the conference. So it's really cool to be back here again. But today, I would like to go a bit more into a topic which is enterprise-grade Angular forms. Now let me first introduce myself very quickly. So as Bonnie mentioned, I'm Juri Strumpflohner. I'm a Google developer expert in web technologies. I'm also a Cyprus ambassador quite recently. I'm coming from Italy. I'm in the very northern part, so in the middle of the Alps. We have a lot of skiing areas there. Very nice also for hiking. And I'm working there at a local company. On the side, I'm also doing some training and consulting, mostly in the front-end space with Angular. And I'm an egghead IO instructor. These are some of my courses. egghead is doing a sale right now, so you might actually be interested in some of these for learning and going ahead in your career in the front-end space. Great. So let's talk about Angular forms, right? It's a really exciting topic. It's the thing you always wanted to build within an Angular app. Well, not really. In my case, it's mostly there are more interesting parts actually in creating an application, like architecture things and so on. So for me, forms are really boring. You have to type a lot, you have the text boxes, and you have to align them nicely. But on the other side, forms can also be quite hard actually. There's a lot of logic going in there, like fields that are connected between each other. They may be disabled based on some user input, based on permissions, based on configuration. So they can be quite difficult. This, for instance, is an actual application, which basically is an enterprise app where Angular is currently quite strong. And it's actually just a subset of the fields that you see here, which are actually on that form, because others are hidden. You don't even see them. They get activated based on some other user input. And so in Angular, we are actually quite happy, because we have two ways of building forms, right? We have the template-driven approach. That's mostly a simpler one. If you get into the forms building, especially if you're coming from AngularJS, it's very good to get started. Personally, I'm more on the reactive forms part, because it's a bit more complex to learn it initially, because it has also the reactive concept. But in the end, if forms get more complex, it helps. It has some extra features which might help you there. Now, although we have these two variants, and also reactive forms are powerful, we're not there yet, right? There are a lot of features missing. The team is currently very heavily focusing on Ivy and getting that shipped with the next version of Angular. So there are a lot of features missing in reactive forms which could be implemented. And I want to show you here this blog post. Definitely check it out. It was published more or less a month ago, which listed a lot whole of features which are currently missing and how they could implement it, with proposals, and also links to various issues which are already open in the Angular repo. So definitely expect there's more coming along on the reactive forms part. So my personal criticism, as I mentioned before, is there's a lot of typing, repetitive typing of input stuff and forms, aligning them and so on. And especially, there's a lot of typing in multiple places, right? If you think, for instance, if you take a look at this form implementation, which is a reactive form, you see here on the left side our component behind the scenes. We have, for instance, here a name input. So we have to define it in our component, right, where we can then basically implement all the logic which we need. But we also have to obviously put it into our HTML part, right? And there you see also the applications, we have that name property. If I want to change that, I have to change that as well in the HTML part. Now, of course, we can somehow get better there, abstract it into components and reuse that. But still, it's kind of complicated and some application here. So how can we fix that? Well, an idea would be that I have my component code, which we have seen before, where in the reactive forms I define my form structure, the form controls and form groups. And then there's something else which actually does the HTML part for me. So it generates those forms form HTML controls out of my configuration in my TypeScript code. And I created a course on that like a year ago, how you could do that, how you could basically take a simple person object, for instance, iterate over its properties, and generate those form controls out on the fly. And it's actually not complicated, or not that complicated, for simple forms. Because the problem is then, well, you have to support different kind of input types, of course. We have checkbox, radio buttons, select box, whatever. Then validation comes along. You have to also support validation. Hiding fields based on some other input fields, so dependent fields, or allowing to configure basically whether a field is hidden, disabled, or whatever you have to implement there. So it gets quickly very messy and very complicated. You have to implement all that by yourself. Now we don't want to do that. There's actually already a library which does a very good job actually in implementing those forms, those configuration-based forms as I call them, and it's Angular Formly. Maybe some of you has already done AngularJS, so Formly was there already very popular. This is basically a new version if you want for the new Angular, so 2+. And basically Formly is constructed in 3 different parts. So you always have the HTML part, but it's a very tiny bit. As you can see, there is that Formly form component, which takes a couple of inputs, and it takes first of all that configuration of the fields. You obviously have to describe our form somewhere, and the model. The model is the data, right? That usually comes from some server. So how does it work? Well, first of all, we have to define that Formly configuration. So we have to basically have that key. We have to tell Formly what's the actual property of my data model which I want to bind to that control. Then I have to give it a type and so on. So there are various properties, and we're going to give that a look very soon. We obviously bind that onto that Formly form component that comes from the Formly library. And we give it also the model, because it has to know obviously what data to render and where to bind it. And finally, then there's the third part, which then Formly does for us. So it generates that HTML for us, right? So we don't have to take care of creating those HTML controls. And so we have exactly that, right? So we have something where I can change my component code, which is in TypeScript, and the HTML will be taken care by Formly. Now, if we take a look at that form here, that HTML, it's obviously connected to some UI library, right? Because this was material, for instance, but you might have Bootstrap, or you might even have your own custom corporate design guides. And so Formly comes in 2 parts, basically, at the library level. So you have the core part, which contains the whole logic, validations, how the form controls are being rendered. And then there are the UI parts. And the UI part is here, these are the ones basically which are already implemented with Formly, like we have Material, Bootstrap, PrimeNG, but also for the mobile, they support Ionic and NativeScript. So it has quite a good coverage so far. Of course, you can also implement your own. So how does the installation work like? Well, it's quite simple actually. You can just use npm. Obviously, as you can see, you install the core part and then the UI part which you want to have, or which you need in your specific setup. You can also use Yarn. What I usually use is what I call ng-add-magic, because as you know, the Angular CLI, with its schematics, provides also library authors a way to support their users. And so Formly, for instance, implemented those schematics. And so it's really, really easy to set up, because we can just say ng-add, we give it the ngx Formly schematics, and we pass it the UI part, which we want, like in this case, material. And then Formly will set up my project, like it will register in this case, for instance, the Formly module, which you can see down there, the for root and the material module, because we told him basically to install the material part. So let's take a look at some of the basics, because this was a lot of talk. Let's see how that actually works. Now for doing that, let me switch over here to my IDE. And as you can see, I have already installed Formly, so I have that Formly for root, and I'm using the material module. And in fact, you can see here the HTML on the side which gets printed out. Now you can see right now it's quite empty. This is the HTML which you see on the side. So we have basically here those buttons which you can see. There's a small debug component which I usually create to basically see what is my current form value and what is my model value. Right now they are both empty. The module is already pre-populated. And then the important part here for the HTML is the one at the very top. So you can see here we have a normal form. And this is actually something you should recognize. This is just a normal reactive form, right? There's nothing specific about that. And instead of having the whole HTML part, which you usually have, we have just basically here that Formly form component, which we got installed via the library. We give it a model, the fields, of course, as we have seen before, and just a reference to that form, so Formly knows where it is attached to. We could even have multiple of these. And with that, we can actually close the HTML, because That's all we have to do right now to set up the form. Let's take a look at the component itself. That's where actually the logic happens. And so here I have the form set up, right? This is a normal form group, reactive form. The difference is maybe here that I don't have any form controls registered. It's just an empty object, because that's where formly comes in and generates all those form controls for me on the fly. I have the model. Now, right now, of course, in this demo application, it's hard-coded, so it's directly here, but usually that would be one that you fetch from the server, right? Which comes in from some HTTP call or even an NGRX store, and you pass it ahead to formly. The important part is this one, and this is where we're going to explore now. So here's where we create the field. So let's create a first field for that first name up there. And basically here, what you see is, let's walk through those properties basically. So the first one is the key. The key is the one with which I tell formally what property it should data bind. So if you take a look here at first name, it's actually the one above here, right? So it knows how to connect to the model. Then we have the type. So this is the type of the input control I want to have. In this case, it's type input, which defaults to text. And then I have some template options which are always present in the formally config, where I can basically add some additional configuration, like change the label, change the appearance, hide it, or whatever. And as you can see on the side, it already renders. Like I have that first name property. It already data binds because it knows the model. And of course, if I change here, the form value will basically synchronize. The nice part with formally is also the model will synchronize. So the model I pass in will also be kept synchronized with my form. So that helps a lot when then dealing with data, or if you just basically visualize a subset of your data that comes from the server, right, on the form. So let's try with the next one. The next one is age. Very similar, like it's just a copy of the one before. We have, of course, changed now to age, and you can see it with being visualized below here on the first name. Now, age is a number, so probably I don't want to allow to input here characters. And so here we can also already do a first customization. And in the template options, we can specify the type of input which we want. In this case, the type number. And so now we have the property that if I type in, it wouldn't allow me to specify characters. Moreover, you get those nice little arrows in the side, which you can then go up and down with arrow keys. Cool. So this is actually quite simple. So this is the most basic form configuration you can have. It gets more interesting with these two here. Like the nation and the city ID, these are just pointers to other entities, right? So this is just, if you want a foreign key to like a nation and a city, which I'm having bound on the model. Now, usually you use a select box for that, right, to visualize. So let's create here a select box. Again, we have nation ID. We have the select here now. I don't have anymore an input, but a select, and the label. The select box gets rendered, but of course, there's no data in there, because usually we have to specify some options for the select box, like those have those options which you iterate on in your template normally. Now, formally, I can just specify them here. In this case, I just hard-code them here into my template. If I open here now, you see the values, right? It's already data bound to Italy. Why? Because Italy has value 1, and basically up here, I have basically nation 1. If I change that to 2, would be Germany, and would switch back to that one, right? So it already data binds. Now, having these hard code is not really real-world use case, right? If you have maybe just a select for yes, no, or something like that, you could hard code it. But usually you have something where you go and fetch it from the server. Now, I have here some city services, I called it, which has some properties on it for fetching, for instance, the nations. Now, right now, it's just basically returning an observable, which kind of simulates what would be an HTTP call, right? You could substitute with an HTTP call, and it would be mostly the same thing. So, first thing first, what we do, of course, is we import that city service, right? So we get that injected into our component. And now the nice property here is with formally, I can directly substitute that options here now with the observable return from that city service. So I don't have to resolve it, but I can directly associate it to the template options. Formally internally recognize that it is a nation and that it is an observable return from that nation property. So we'll automatically bind to it and visualize it on our component. And as you can see here, if I open it up, I have the new nations bound to my form here. Same goes with the city service, right? So it's just a copy of what we have in the nations here. So again, now we have all the cities in here, and the data binds nicely. Now, of course, the customer would come along here and say, well, look, Juri, whenever I change here the nation, I actually don't want to see all of the cities, but I want to have them filtered. So you start getting fields which depend on each other. So we want to filter them, of course, based on what the user selects. Now, interestingly, that cities service, that get cities method, already accepts the nation ID and then filters it internally because it also has here that nation ID attached. So with that, I can filter it, right? And so this wouldn't work here. But rather what I would have, or I would want to do here, is I would like to register whenever this changes here, get the new nation ID, pass it along to that get cities method, and then basically wrap up the whole thing again. And so informally what we have here is what is called hooks. Now, these are not React hooks, but it's a way for hooking into the life cycle of my formally component here if you want. And it has an on init, which takes here a formally field config. And with that formally field config, I have a couple of nice properties. It's basically just that field configuration which I have here. And so you can start interacting with that. And what it has, for instance, here, it has a form on top of it. And that form gives me access now to the entire reactive form which I have. And so from here on, I'm just in reactive forms land. So I can do whatever I can do in reactive forms. I can, for instance, here do get, and I do the nation ID. And then I can use the value changes and hook onto that observable and continue that way, right? So how would that look like? Basically, I'm taking here, as I mentioned, the nation ID. I'm using that value changes. And then I switch map into that and pass basically again ahead that nation ID to that get city service. It will return me the observable of filtered cities, which I then just associate to the template option above, which we saw before, right? And so with that, I've hooked it up already. If I change here to Germany, you can see here I have just German cities. If I change to Italy, we just have Italian cities, right? And it's already basically data bound. Now the next step then is usually, well, but if you like remove here nation, I don't actually want the user to be able to choose the city before because it doesn't just make any sense, right? So it should be disabled, for instance. Now formally template options actually have a disabled property. So I can just go here and specify it on top here. Problem is this is static, so I can just provide true and false. But what I need actually is something dynamic, right? And so formally has there a cool property, which is called expression properties. Now expression properties allow me to dynamically change and fiddle around with the configuration of my formally component here. And so for instance, what I can do is I can set that template options disabled or whatever you want to set from that template options here. And it gives me a callback method where it passes me the model, among other things, if I want. And I'm simply saying whenever the nation is not set, the formally form gets disabled. And so if I take a look at whether that works perfectly. So the form, the cities below would get disabled. Now if you pay attention, and I know it's tough just before the lunch break, but this is actually a bug right now because I'm choosing some city here, then I remove the nation, but the city somehow remains selected in my model. So we would send that back to the server and we'd get an inconsistent state somehow, or a validation exception, whatever. So I really want to have that dependent on the change. So I want to reset that city actually if the nation gets deselected. Now I could hook into D here, so create some side effect if you want, and change directly. Or I can also handle it over the expression properties again. Like I cannot only just interact with here that formally configuration, but I can also set the city ID on the model directly. So this model is a conventional parameter, which is always called model basically. And then I can also either again use that function callback or also a string expression, which formally will then evaluate at runtime. And I do the same thing. I say whenever the nation ID is not defined, I want to have null assigned to my city ID. Otherwise, I just leave it whatever it is right now. So if you pay attention now, if I deselect here, the city gets null again, and so I'm fine. It's reset basically automatically for me. And we could go a bit on like this, right? There are a lot of properties which you could specify. Another thing is usually I want to hide basically that city ID whenever the nation is not selected. So I don't want to even have the user basically to see it there. And again, we specify that via that hide expression. The callback function is just identical to what I have in the disabled part. And now if I remove here the nation, it gets hidden below and it just disappears from my screen. So you see it's very easy to create these connected things. And what I really like is you can pass in direct observables. You can even pass in observables to those hide expressions. So you don't have to use a function callback, but you can directly feed them in an observable, which gets even more powerful. Cool, so far so to that. Now another thing that often happens is the customer comes to me and says like, well, I now have that nice nation you select, but I have like 2,000 nations in there. I want to have some autocomplete or something like that where I can search for it, because it's just not practical to do it like this. And that means I have to create a custom form control. Now I could go and, for instance, say, I know there's ngSelect, right? I want to make it to work with Formly. So I want to integrate that into Formly. Now just specifying here ngSelect wouldn't work, of course. What I have to do here is to create a custom form control for Formly. And so I created one here. How does that look like? Well, you have a normal Angular component, first of all. You have the template and everything. The only thing that differs, if you want, is that you extend it from that field type. And that field type is a Formly specific thing, via which basically I inherit a lot of properties and stuff. One of those are this TO property, this TO variable. And TO stands for template options, and it's exactly that template options property which you have seen before now in the whole form configuration. And so via that, I can access to the options, I can get access to the label, and I also get the form control already fed in, so I can just pass it along, or also just directly use it here in my custom form control. I usually tend to create separate components, like in this case it's an external one, like ngSelect, which I just configure and pass along the Formly parts. But even if I create my own form control, I usually create it separately, because then you could also use it outside Formly, of course. So you're not too tied, basically, to just use it in Formly. So with that, we are actually set up. One thing that I'm missing here is I have to also register it to Formly. I have to tell Formly now where that component is. And what you do here is you do that in that types configuration of my Formly module. So I basically say whenever you see the type my autocomplete, or whatever you want to name it, then you use this component. And so if I go back now, I can just switch out here that select to my autocomplete. The page here refreshes. Now the styling is not perfect, of course, I'm not a designer. But if I open up here, you see now it changed slightly, right? I can now start typing, right? If I choose Germany, press enter, you can see how everything else just keeps on working, because it uses the same mechanism behind the scenes. I just exchanged the control. And you can see how you could now create custom Formly controls also for your maybe corporate design guidelines, right? Which might be different to Bootstrap or different to Material entirely. Cool. One thing we obviously cannot miss is validation. Form validation is a core part. And for instance, here on the age, we could specify some validator. Now, Formly has already something built in. Some of these, some classic ones, like standard ones. For instance, min, I could say whenever the age is like below 18, it basically invalidates that field. Now it gets red. I'm not sure you can see it on the projector, but the field is basically invalid. Now, of course, we also want to basically visualize a validation message. Again, that's something you just specify here on that Formly configuration. So it has a validation object here and a series of messages, and I can say whenever the min validator fails, this is what you're going to display basically on the screen. And so just to very quickly show that, now you see the message below. Now, of course, we don't want to specify that message over and over again throughout our application, because that wouldn't make sense. For instance, for something standard like required, where I'm here setting it to true basically on my first name, you can see how now I get a star, so it basically signals to the user that this is a required field, and if I relieve it, we already have the message here. So I didn't specify that explicitly, because specifying explicitly is only something I'm going to do for very specific validators, which don't happen that often. The common ones, on the other side, can be registered directly again on the Formly module. So I can here have a validation messages array, where I say whenever it is required, this is the message you should display on all of those. And I can, of course, override them in my Formly configuration if I need for some specific forms. Cool. A last part I would like to show you is extensions. Formly extensions is still experimental if you want, because it's not well documented, but it's production proof. Like, you can definitely start using it. You can just have to search it a bit in the source code. What extensions allow you is to implement cross-cutting behavior through forms. And let me just show you quickly one which I've basically implemented. I've added here a so-called loader extension. So whenever I have an observable, which could potentially be async, I want to show a loading indicator besides the form to signal the user this data is not here yet, it's being loaded. And so Formly extension allows you to hook into the pre-populate, on-populate, and post-populate phase of the configuration creation. And so how does it look like? Well, I implemented here the pre-populated, and I said whenever a field type, and here basically field are all the fields of my forms which get passed through that method here, you could like think about it as a reducer, right, which gets called for every configuration you have. Then I can intercept some of them. And basically here I'm hooking onto that onInit method. First of all, I call the original one. I don't want to override the one the developer probably specified. And then I say, whenever that template options is section observable, I want to do some stuff. In this case, I'm just attaching a class. And that class will show me a nice spinner on the form field. And then I register on that observable. And I say, whenever the data comes in, or an error happens, or it finalizes, it concludes basically the observable, I just want to reset to the original class name. I want to remove basically my formally loader. Now, of course, you have to register that. So in the app module, again, there is a dedicated section which is called extensions. And you can hook that in here, give it a unique name, and you reference that function. And now to simulate that, let me go to the city service, and I have some artificial delay on top here. Now, if you pay attention to that city loader here, you can see here there is a small animation happening. Once the data arrives, it disappears. And this is a very powerful mechanism for implementing such cross-cutting functionality. So you don't have to pollute every form field configuration, but you rather can specify it at a central place. For instance, something which I often also do, probably some of you had a Cypress workshop yesterday, is Cypress uses this data CY attributes to grab basically fields very easily. You could implement, for instance, an extension which just uses the form property that's data bound on the field and add those data CI properties automatically. So in the Cypress stats, you can very easily grab basically fields of your form. Those are just some of the examples which you could actually do. All right, so what else? Well, there's a lot of stuff basically. First of all, I would highly suggest go and check out the source code. For instance, what often happens, as I mentioned before, you cannot really use Material, and then you cannot really use Bootstrap, but you have your own custom style guide within a large corporation. And so what you probably are going to do is you implement that UI part of Formally yourself. And it sounds scary, but actually you can just use like what is closest to what you are using in your company. For instance, you use the Bootstrap UI part on Formally on GitHub, and you see how they implement the select boxes, how they implement the input fields, and you just adapt it to your needs. You create your own library. What I also often do is I create a kind of a custom DSL. What does that mean? Well, you've seen that Formally configuration can get quite long, right? And most of the time, you always need the same kind of configuration, like the same template options and so on. And so what you can do is you can create kind of a wrapper around it. For instance, here I have a couple of dedicated methods, like an input field number, select, and so on, or an autocomplete. And internally, I will then create those Formally configurations and return it to Formally itself. And that's because then a Formally configuration could look as easy as this one, like these are all one-liners. I'm just telling, give me an input of the, key, of the property first name and the label is first name, and that's it, right? Also, for instance, in that last one here, that Formally select, I could even generalize it more. If I know that my select, the city select, looks always identical across my application, like it always attaches to this endpoint or to this property in my NGRX store, I can just do something like that. Like I can call it city select, and I use it in my form configuration. And so in this way, I'm reusing actually not the components itself, but the configuration across my various forms, which can get really, really powerful. So to conclude, there are a lot more stuff. Like Formally has support for repeats, for like tabbed forms, nested forms. There's a lot more going on. An important part is also those JSON-powered forms. We actually had it in a project where the client said us, well, like we want to fully customize how the form looks like. I want to know, basically, I want to configure what input fields are there, whether it's a select, whether it's an autocomplete on the server side. So they had a dedicated UI where they could configure the input fields. And what Formally supports here, for instance, is a JSON schema, which you can then generate on the server side, export it to the client. Formally will read that JSON schema. You can pass it to your own like callback and then customize it further and then just pass it along to Formally, and it would render the form just as if you programmed it basically hardcode as we did in the demo before. So they can be really powerful. And there are some more schemas planned, like schemas for GraphQL and for more advanced based layouts. So in general, I think forms created with Formally are very easy. You can create them very fast, and they can basically be easy to use and maintainable. They're also quite flexible. It doesn't seem initially, but as we have seen, we can quite custom the form, how it looks like, how it reacts. We can implement our custom form controls. And so you can have really high reusability via sharing those configurations across your various forms. Usually it needs more work when you initially have to set it up. Like when you first get started with Formally and you have to implement it for your own style guide within your company, you have to create those UI controls, of course, up front or as you're going. But once you have that, you have really high consistency also across your forms because they look all the same because you can control them from a central point. I would like to thank this guy here. He's the core maintainer of Formally, and he does an awesome job like in concluding issues, like closing them, fixing them, adding features, giving support to people. I don't know how he does it, but it's really like he was 5 people working on the form. So it's really, really a good guy. And therefore also, if you're using it in your project and you find it useful, I know that sponsor button is always quite small up there, but at least like buy him a coffee, buy him a beer, I think he would be quite happy. Cool, so thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm outside, just come to me or join me online on Twitter or on my website. Thanks you.